Junia Marsh kept a wash tent at the end of the track and scrubbed the soiled linen of rough men for coin, and the respectable side of the camp town had decided she was a fallen woman for it, when the truth was that she was a widow doing the one honest thing left to her. She did not know yet that before the first hard snow, a near-silent man off the bridge crew, a man she had washed shirts for and scarcely spoken to, would put his own name beside hers against the whole company and change the entire shape of her life. It had begun the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her husband, Tom Marsh, had been a track gang man who swung a maul on the grade from first light. And one gray morning a loaded hand car broke loose on the downgrade and ran wild, and when they carried Tom up from the cut, he was already gone. She buried him beside the line in the raw dirt and went to the paymaster's car for the wages he was owed, the back pay of a hard season. And the agent looked at his book and told her, smooth as cream, that there was no entry there for a Tom Marsh. That whatever her husband had claimed, the book said otherwise, and the book was the book. He was sorry for her loss. The wage was gone the way Tom was gone, written out of the world by a man with a clean ledger and a clean collar. So Junia did the only honest thing a woman alone in a railroad camp could do. She set up 2 iron tubs and a copper boiler under a sailcloth tent at the edge of the camp, and she took in washing. She boiled and scrubbed and wrung and pressed the linen of the grading crews and the bridge men and the teamsters, and she charged a fair price and kept herself to herself. And the respectable side of the camp, the side with the painted houses and the church tent and the superintendent's wife at the head of it, looked at a young widow taking in the wash of unmarried men, and decided by supper of her first week exactly what that made her. The word went round the way the worst words always do, quiet and certain and impossible to answer, and Junia Marsh, who had done nothing she was ashamed of, became a thing the decent women crossed the street to avoid. Here is the thing the camp had not troubled to learn about the woman it had so much to say about. Junia was not a soft girl who had drifted into trouble. She was 26, raised by a widowed mother who had taken in other people's washing every day of her life. And she had stood at a washtub since she was small enough to need a box to reach it. She had the one thing of her mother's worth carrying, a heavy old flat-iron black cast iron with a turned wood handle worn pale and smooth, the iron her mother had heated on the stove and pressed Sunday collars with through 30 hard years. She heated it on her little camp stove and pressed the crew's good shirts of an evening, and the steady hiss of it on the damp cloth was the one sound in that loud, rough camp that sounded like home. And none of it would matter, because a debt had come for her on top of the rest. A week after she buried Tom, the company stores sent word that there was an account standing in the Marsh name. Run up against credit through the bad months, more money than Junia had ever held at one time, and that the company expected it settled. She had never run that account. But the ledger had her dead husband's name in a clerk's neat hand, and a dead man cannot say he never bought a thing, and the same agent who had found no entry for Tom's wage had found a great deal of entry for Tom's debt. Junia understood, standing in that store with the figure swimming in front of her, that the two were one thing wearing 2 faces. They had kept his wage and hung his debt on her, and they meant to have the little she had left. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck or by a fortune dropping out of a clear sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever winter you have been handed, and if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Junia is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul standing at the rough edge of the world to see a person plain when the whole camp has already decided not to. The silent soul who would see her plain was a bridge carpenter named Caleb Stroud, and every man on the line would have told you he was the closest-mouthed fellow in the camp. He framed the trestles that carried the track over the cuts and the creeks, slow, careful work that wanted a man who measured twice and said little, and he kept apart. He had come west 3 years before with a wife and lost her to a fever their first winter on the plains, in a tent not unlike the one Junia washed under, and he had not married again nor wished to, and had got so far out of the habit of company that the men took his grief for coldness, the way men do. But Caleb Stroud had eyes, and what they had been telling him for weeks was that the laundress the camp had decided to scorn carried herself with more plain dignity than any of the women who scorned her. He saw her work bent over the steaming tubs from dark to dark, and never once let the camp see her bend, and keep her chin up when the decent wives stepped wide of her on the plank walk, as though their contempt were a kind of weather she had decided not to feel. And he heard, the way a quiet man hears everything, the agent and the clerk talking low over their coffee about the Marsh account, and he understood before she did that they did not mean to be paid. They meant to take her tent and her tubs against the debt and put her off the company's land, and call it business. If you've made it this far into Junia's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was a raw evening late in the fall when the thing came to a head. The agent, a man named Lucius Crane, who wore a clean collar and a cap full of dirty ones, walked out to her tent with the store clerk at his shoulder and told her, in front of whoever cared to hear, that the account in her husband's name was past due, and that unless she had the money, which they both knew she did not, he would take the tent and its contents in part settlement and see her off the line before the weather closed in. He was sorry. He was always sorry. And Junia stood in the door of the tent that was the last thing she owned, the old iron cooling on the board behind her. And she did not beg, because she had learned from her mother that begging only feeds the kind of man who comes to watch you do it, but she felt the cold go all the way through her, because she had no answer and nowhere to go. Caleb Stroud was there. He had brought his wash down at the end of his shift, and he stood off in the dusk and heard the whole of it. And something in his quiet face had gone very still and very hard. He said nothing while Crane talked. He waited until the agent had tipped his clean hat and walked back toward the lit part of the camp, and then he set his bundle down on the crate and took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands and said to Junia Marsh the longest thing he had said to anyone in 3 years. He said he knew it was not his place, but he had heard what they meant to do, and it was not right. A thing she had not done costing her the name she had kept clean through all of it. And then he said there was one way to stop them, if she could stand the idea. The company could put a lone widow off its land and call it nothing. But it could not so easily turn out a married couple who worked the line, and a dead first husband's debt had no clean claim on a new married woman with a new name and a husband drawing company wages. If she would let him marry her on paper, plain and quiet before the snow, the agent's whole game came apart in his hands. He would take his bunk in the bridge crew's car and ask nothing of her she did not freely give. She would keep her tent and her trade and her wage and her own self entire. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat and not to her face, because he could not have made it any other way. Junia did not answer that night. She lay awake on her cot with the canvas snapping in the wind and turned it over. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and her own livelihood handed back to her, the very things the company had set out to take. And he had offered it without once making her feel small, without the pity that was worse than the gossip. As if it were a plain matter of justice and not of charity. In the gray morning she heated the old iron until it hissed at a wet finger and pressed a clean collar smooth, and when Caleb came by for his wash she told him, steady, that she would take his name through the winter and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him, she would learn, was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the camp's circuit preacher in the lee of the bridge crew's car, with 2 of Caleb's fellows for witnesses and the wind off the plains for music. There was no ring and no kiss, because that was not what this was. Caleb said the words low, looking at the rail, and Junia said hers, looking out at the long line of track running off into the brown distance. That night Junia slept in her own tent, a married woman, and Caleb slept in the crew car, a married man, and the old iron sat on the board between the tubs in the dark, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that autumn into winter was the slow making of them. The snow came early and stayed, and there was nowhere much to be but at the work of staying warm and fed and clean. And though Caleb kept faithfully to the crew car at night and asked her for nothing, a marriage that 2 people mean only as a paper has a way of leaking into the daylight whether they will or no. He took to splitting her stove wood small before the cold could find her hands, and mended the broken leg of her wash-bench so true she could not find where it had been, and rigged a windbreak on the weather side of her tent without a word. And she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, the language of made and mended things, and she began, without quite deciding to do for him in return. Turned the frayed collar on his one good shirt so fine he held it to the lamp and could not find the seam, and washed his work clothes last and best. And the talk between 2 people who had married to stop talk came slow and then easier, the way a frozen pump comes when you work it. She found he was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent 3 years with no one worth saying it to, and that if she went on with her ironing and did not press him, the words came on their own, low, at the edge of the lamplight, dry and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her, a piece at a time, about the wife he had lost and the house he had meant to build her and never did, and Junia did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. They did not name what was happening. But the loud, rough camp had stopped being a place she merely survived, and the crew car a place he merely slept, and they both felt the change and were afraid of it. Because winter ends, and a thing built to last one winter has no business growing roots. It was the old iron that opened the way through. One white afternoon, with the wash froze on the line and no work to be had, Junia took the flat iron down to oil the wood of the handle against the dry cold, the way her mother had taught her. And she worked the worn handle loose from its catch as she had 100 times, and this time, folded into the hollow of the grip where the iron seated, she found a square of paper gone soft and brown at the creases, with her own name on the front in her mother's labored hand. The hand was the unsteady hand of her mother's last months. And Junia understood that her mother had written it knowing she was dying, and hidden it in the one thing she knew her daughter would keep and use and one day take apart to care for, and never said a word. She sat down on the edge of her cot in the cold tent and read it. Her mother had written that the great fear of her dying was not the dying, but the worry that her good, hard-working girl would come to believe that being useful was the same as being loved, and would spend her life at a wash-tub with her chin up and her heart shut, asking nothing of anybody because she had learned too young how to do without. The iron will press other folks' Sunday best till your hands give out, her mother had written. But it cannot put its arms around you, and I did not raise you only to be of use." And then, at the very last, in a line that must have cost the dying woman the final of her strength, "Do not let your pride or their hard words keep you from being loved when the time comes. When a good soul sees the whole of you and does not look away, let him. That is the one thing I want for you still. Now I cannot give it to you myself. Live, Junia, be warm." She wept then, the way she had not let herself weep since they carried Tom up from the cut, alone on the cot with her mother's last kindness open in her lap. Her mother had not spent her dying breath praising her daughter's strong back and busy hands. She had spent it begging her to set the weight down and let herself be held. And the quiet man in the crew car, who saw the whole of her and did not look away, was the very thing her mother had written she was allowed to want. The next morning, when Caleb came stamping the snow off his boots and she handed him his coffee, she let her chapped hand rest against his on the warm tin a moment longer than she ever had, and did not pull it away. And he looked down at her hand and then up at her face and did not say one word, and everything was said. Then the worst of the winter came down on the camp, and with it the very reckoning Junia had been bracing for, though it did not come the way she had feared. A bad fever broke out among the men, the kind that runs fast through a crowded camp, and the company doctor, a contract man with a soft billet down the line, was nowhere to be found when it started, and slow to come when he was sent for. Men went down in the bunk cars faster than there were sound hands to tend them. And the respectable side of the camp shut its doors and drew its curtains and waited for it to burn itself out. And into that gap, without anyone asking her, stepped the laundress they had all decided was beneath them. Junia Marsh knew exactly two things the camp needed in a fever and did not have: boiling water and clean cloth, and she had spent her whole life making both. She carried clean hot linen from car to car, changed the soaked bedding under men who could not lift their own heads, and sat up by lamplight with the worst of them where the doctor was absent. Caleb worked the nights at her side without being asked, carrying the boiler water and lifting the men she could not. The two of them moving through the sick camp in the cold dark like a thing long practiced. And slow, over a hard fortnight, the fever broke and let the camp go, and when the doctor finally rode in the worst was over, and every rough man on that line knew exactly whose boiled sheets and whose steady hands had carried them through it, and it was not the doctor's and not the company's. So when the thaw started to loosen the winter, and Lucius Crane came back out to finish the business he had started, a paper in his hand, meaning to settle the dead man's debt at last, and put her off the line now the marriage had failed to make her go, he found he had walked into the wrong camp. He had not been there in the fever. He did not know what the winter had made. He stood at the door of the tent, and began on the old account in his smooth, sorry voice, and before he was well started, the men began to come. They came off the bridge crew and the grading gangs, the rough, unmarried men whose linen the town had shamed her for washing, and they stood around that tent in the melting snow with their hats in their hands and made it immovably plain that the agent was taking nothing and putting nobody off any line. One of them, a steady old timekeeper named Asa Pickett, who had no love for Crane, had brought a thing of his own, the company's true paybook for the season Tom Marsh died, with Tom's wage entered plain and never paid, and not one honest dollar of the store's debt in it. He laid it open on the wash bench, and the thing the company had buried stood suddenly in the daylight where every man could read it. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The men simply stood for their own, and the agent who had come to sit in judgment on a friendless widow found himself judged instead, the proof of his own crooked book open on the bench, and 40 hard witnesses between him and the woman he had come to ruin. Lucius Crane tried once or twice at the smooth words that had always served him, and found there was no room left in that camp for them, and he folded his paper and walked back toward the lit part of the camp for the last time. A few weeks later, when word of the buried paybook worked its way up the line, the company found it had no use for an agent whose ledgers would not bear looking at, and Crane was gone for good, and the debt went with him. Caleb Stroud had stood at the back of that crowd the whole while with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he crossed the trampled snow to stand at Junia's side, where the whole camp could see him do it, the first time he had ever put himself plainly beside her in front of anyone. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said low, but not so low that the nearest could not hear it, that he had told her in the fall he would set her free in the spring, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to be free of her, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any paper got up against a railroad, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Junia Marsh, who had made her peace with red hands and being of use to people who would not say her name, looked at the silent man who had seen the whole of her through a long, hard winter and never once looked away, and heard her mother's letter in her own ears, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early spring, for true this time. When the line had pushed on west and the camp had settled into a proper little town, they stood up together in the new plank church that had been only a tent the autumn before, with the rough crews she had nursed crowded into the back in their good shirts, the very shirts she had washed and pressed, and a few of the respectable wives near the front, looking a shade ashamed of themselves. As well they might. The circuit preacher who had married them in the lee of a railroad car said the words right at last, with the spring light coming through the new glass, and the heavy old iron that had pressed Sunday collars for 2 generations of working women had pressed the simple dove-gray dress Junia was married in, smooth as still water, because the worn black thing that had been the one sound of home through every lonely season had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come to the railhead a trackman's wife, and been left a widow with red hands and a stolen name, certain the best of her life lay buried beside the line with Tom. She grew old in that town that had been a camp, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would, and the wash tent gave way in time to a real laundry, with her name over the door, and the women who had once crossed the street to shun her brought their good linen to her counter. The old iron stood on a shelf in the warm by then, set down for good. Beside a second iron newer than itself, waiting for the young woman come to learn the trade at the famous laundress's elbow, and on the last evening of this story the two of them caught the low gold light through the front glass, the old worn one and the new. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth. And the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the world has hung a name on you that you did not earn, do you let your pride and their hard words keep you small and alone, or do you trust that the right soul will see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the bright one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.